A farewell tour is supposed to give everyone time. Time for the band to revisit the songs. Time for the audience to stand one last time. Time for an aging performer to decide which version of himself will remain when the lights finally go out. Steven Tyler was supposed to have that. The tour was called Peace Out, a title that sounded casual, almost mischievous. Exactly the sort of goodbye Aerosmith might choose after more than half a century of surviving everything that should have ended them. There would be scarves on the microphone, Joe Perry at his side, and thousands of people singing words they had carried since the 1970s. But the goodbye stopped after only a handful of shows, not because the public lost interest, not because the band collapsed in another backstage war. His body interrupted him. During a September 2023 performance on Long Island, Tyler suffered serious damage to his voice, later described as a fractured larynx. At first, the language sounded temporary: postponed dates, medical care, recovery time. Aerosmith had cancelled shows, survived injuries, endured addiction, and returned from commercial death. The public did not immediately understand this as an ending, because Steven Tyler had trained people not to believe in his endings. Every collapse in his career eventually became another comeback. When Aerosmith was dismissed as a drug-ravaged remnant of the 70s, they returned larger than before. When sobriety threatened the mythology of the reckless rock star, Tyler proved he could perform without destroying himself every night. Even age became something he wore theatrically. Another scarf, another ring, another mark on the costume. So when his voice failed, many assumed this would become one more survival story. It did not. In August 2024, Aerosmith announced that Tyler had spent months working with doctors, but could not fully recover enough for the demands of touring. The remaining dates were cancelled. The band retired from the touring stage. Read that carefully. From touring. Because the story became confusing almost immediately. Tyler later returned for selected performances. He sang at charitable events. In 2025, he even appeared with Joe Perry on stage. To a casual observer, that could look like proof that the announcement had been exaggerated. But singing several songs on one carefully chosen night is not the same as carrying an Aerosmith tour from city to city. Steven Tyler did not lose every trace of his voice. He lost the reliable, repeatable version of it, the version that could promise tomorrow night, next week, another arena, another dream on. A voice can still exist and no longer support the life built around it. You may have seen clips of those later appearances and thought, he is still singing, so what was really lost? Notice how everyone watches him now. The audience is no longer simply waiting for the scream. They are measuring the distance between the sound they remember and the sound his body can still produce. Each performance carries a question that never used to be there. Can he finish? That is a cruel way for a singer to become visible. For decades, Steven controlled attention by overwhelming a room. He moved first, screamed louder, dressed brighter. Now, attention comes from uncertainty. People lean forward because they want to hear him, and because they are afraid of what might happen when he tries. I do not think the deepest loss is merely vocal range. It is control. Peace Out was supposed to be an organized final chapter, a public ritual in which Tyler could choose the last song, take the final bow, and leave before anyone had to watch him become smaller than the legend. Instead, the story broke in the middle of a performance. No carefully prepared final night, no completed circle. Just postponed dates, months of hope, and a statement admitting that the instrument everyone assumed would survive had reached a limit. And yet Steven kept appearing. That contradiction will guide everything that follows. He cannot tour as he once did, but he has not accepted disappearance. He can no longer guarantee the scream, yet he still walks toward the microphone. Maybe that is courage, maybe it is habit. Or maybe after spending nearly his entire life becoming Steven Tyler in front of an audience, he does not fully know who he is when no one is watching. There is a habit in the way Steven Tyler's story is usually told. Every collapse is followed by a rescue. Every disaster is treated as the dark hallway leading toward a brighter room. That version is comforting. It is also incomplete. Tyler did not simply survive one crisis and become wiser. He survived by becoming good at finding exits, sometimes before he understood what he was escaping from. In the late 1970s, Aerosmith was one of the biggest rock bands in America, but success had turned their chaos into an industry. Money did not calm anything. It removed limits. Drugs were no longer occasional. They became part of the schedule, part of the identity, almost part of the job. The public saw danger and called it authenticity. That distinction matters. Rock audiences often reward behavior that would terrify them in life. A man staggering off stage can be called tragic at home and legendary under spotlights. Stephen learned that contradiction early. The more unstable he became, the more he fit the image people expected. Then Joe Perry left. The breakup of the Toxic Twins is often presented as a feud between two personalities. But look closer. The damage was not that two friends stopped speaking. Aerosmith lost the tension that made its music feel dangerous without becoming shapeless. Without Perry, Tyler still had the name, stage, and costume. What he did not have was the person who pushed against him. That part gets overlooked. Some performers need admiration. Others need resistance. Tyler appeared to need both. As the band declined, his performances became less reliable. Lyrics disappeared. Timing slipped. The man once praised for commanding a room could no longer command himself. And still, the story did not end. Perry returned. The original lineup was restored. Rehab followed. Then another attempt. Then anger. Then, eventually, sobriety. This is where most documentaries begin using the language of redemption. But recovery did not erase the older pattern. It changed the kind of exit available to him. Before, drugs helped him leave reality. Later, reinvention did. Aerosmith's collaboration with Run DMC brought the band back into attention. The albums that followed transformed them from damaged 70s survivors into polished MTV giants. New fans did not meet the collapsing Steven Tyler. They met the recovered one, energetic, funny, theatrical, and indestructible. You can understand why that image became irresistible. The comeback allowed the audience to believe survival had settled every question. It had not. Sobriety was real. The musical recovery was real. The work required to rebuild the band was real. But public redemption moves faster than repair. A hit song can change a reputation in 4 minutes. Relationships take years. Shame can take longer. Some damage never agrees to become inspirational. I think Steven discovered something powerful. If he kept moving, the next version of himself might outrun the last one. Rock star, survivor, MTV personality, father trying to reconnect, television judge, country singer, elder statesman, each identity was genuine. Each was also an exit. That does not make the reinventions dishonest. People are allowed to change, but change and escape can look similar from a distance. Ask yourself, what made his comeback satisfying? Was it the music, the discipline, or the relief of seeing a familiar face return without forcing us to examine everything that happened while he was gone? Steven Tyler became one of rock's survivors because he refused to remain inside any single failure. For decades, another door appeared. The tragedy is that the body became the one room with no exit left. A successful comeback does something strange to memory. It does not merely add a new chapter. It quietly edits the earlier ones. By the early 1990s, Steven Tyler was no longer being introduced as the singer who had nearly destroyed Aerosmith. He was the proof that destruction could be reversed. The band had returned with larger songs, sharper videos, younger audiences, and a new kind of fame that reached far beyond rock radio. That transformation was remarkable. It was also convenient. The comeback gave everyone a better story to tell. For the record industry, Aerosmith became evidence that an old band could be repackaged for a new generation. For fans, Steven became the survivor who had beaten addiction without losing his danger. For television, he became a face audiences could recognize instantly, unpredictable enough to be entertaining, controlled enough to remain employable. The collapse had not vanished. It had simply become the opening act for the resurrection. And once a resurrection becomes successful enough, people stop asking what remained buried underneath it. Consider the version of Steven Tyler that dominated MTV. He was wild, but safely wild. Sexual, but commercially polished. Older than many of the artists around him, yet presented as if age had somehow failed to reach him. That image required discipline. The scarves, the movement, the jokes, the exaggerated expressions, they looked spontaneous, but they also protected him. Steven Tyler had learned how to turn instability into a recognizable brand. The audience no longer had to fear that he might fall apart. Falling apart had become part of the costume. That is a difficult distinction to see. A man can perform chaos so convincingly that no one notices how carefully he is managing it. The videos for Cryin', Amazing, and Crazy placed Aerosmith at the center of youth culture again. The band did not merely recover its old audience. It entered the bedrooms of teenagers who had never seen the 70s collapse and had no emotional connection to the original damage. To them, Steven Tyler was not a comeback story. He was simply present. That may have been his greatest victory. It may also have been his most effective disguise. The public loves redemption when it arrives with a chorus. We prefer evidence we can sing along to. A sold-out arena feels more persuasive than a private apology. A Grammy appears measurable. Repair does not. And so the new Aerosmith gradually replaced the damaged one in public memory. But private history does not update that easily. Children still remember absence. Former partners remember the person who existed before the interviews became reflective. Bandmates remember the rooms where charm stopped working. Sobriety can change behavior, but it cannot travel backward. Steven himself seemed to understand that. He rarely presented recovery as a single clean victory. Relapse returned through prescription painkillers after medical procedures. Physical pain reopened old doors. The man celebrated as a symbol of survival still had to negotiate with the same vulnerability years later. That detail matters because it complicates the heroic version. He did not conquer addiction and walk away. He built a life in which the battle became less visible. There is another way to look at Aerosmith's second peak. It was not only proof that Steven could change, it was proof that the public was willing to accept a new version of him without demanding a complete accounting of the old one. Perhaps that is true of most famous people. We do not follow them because we know them. We follow the version that arrives at the right moment and gives us the feeling we need. In Steven's case, audiences needed the comeback to mean something larger. That talent could survive ruin. That age did not have to mean irrelevance. That a man could lose nearly everything and still return louder than before. Those ideas were not false, they were simply unfinished. Because a comeback can restore a career without repairing a family. It can restore a voice without correcting the past. It can make an audience forgive before the people closest to the damage have decided what forgiveness means. That is what the bright lights concealed. The more successful Steven became again, the easier it was to believe the story had resolved itself. But success is not resolution. Sometimes it is only the most beautiful place to hide what remains unresolved. Some stories become powerful because they are true. Others become powerful because they arrange the truth into a shape people desperately want to believe. Steven Tyler's relationship with Liv Tyler sits somewhere between those two things. For the first years of her life, Liv did not know Steven was her biological father. She believed musician Todd Rundgren was her dad because he was the man who signed her birth certificate and helped raise her. Her mother, Baby Buell, had decided that Steven's life was too unstable to place a child inside it. That decision is often reduced to one sentence: Steven was addicted to drugs. But imagine what that sentence actually meant in a home. It meant that people close to him did not merely worry he might be unreliable. They believed another man should carry the responsibility of fatherhood because Steven could not safely do it. That is more than absence. It is replacement. Liv eventually began noticing the resemblance between herself and Steven's other daughter, Mia. The truth emerged gradually, then all at once. Steven Tyler, the man on stage, the face on television, the figure surrounded by noise, was her biological father. Most biographies treat that discovery as the beginning of a healing story, and in many ways, it was. Steven had entered recovery. He began contacting Liv and her mother. Father and daughter developed a relationship. They appeared together publicly. They spoke warmly about one another. The missing years did not prevent affection from growing later, but affection is not a time machine. That part is rarely emphasized. When a parent returns, the child does not simply receive the parent. The child must also reinterpret every earlier memory. Who was present? Who was absent? Who protected whom? Which father was real? The answer in Liv's life was not simple. Todd Rundgren remained important to her. Stephen became important too. She did not replace one father with another. She learned to live with two different truths. Then came, "I don't want to miss a thing." Aerosmith recorded the song for Armageddon, the film in which Liv played a daughter facing the possible loss of her father. Stephen's voice carried the central ballad, while his biological daughter appeared on screen inside a story about separation, sacrifice, and missed time. The symbolism was almost too perfect, and perhaps that is why people embraced it so completely. The song was not written by Stephen as an apology to Liv. It was written by Diane Warren for a Hollywood film. Yet once you know their history, it becomes difficult not to hear it differently. That does not make the interpretation false. It makes it ours. We turned the song into the confession we wanted him to make. We heard a father promising not to miss another moment. We heard regret for birthdays, ordinary mornings, and years that could not be replayed. The film offered the emotional scene. Their real history supplied the weight. But there is a danger in beautiful symbolism. It can make repair look complete when it is only beginning. One successful song cannot resolve 11 years of absence. A red carpet photograph cannot explain what it feels like to discover your identity in public. Even love, when it finally arrives, does not cancel the conditions that made it late. I think this is why the story still moves people, not because Stephen became the perfect father, but because he returned without being able to recover the beginning. You may recognize something uncomfortable in that. Families often celebrate reunion because reunion is easier to photograph than the years before it. We focus on the embrace, not the hesitation. We admire the person who came back and sometimes overlook the person who waited. Liv's grace helped shape Stephen's public redemption. Her warmth made it possible for audiences to see him not only as the absent father, but as someone capable of rebuilding a bond. Yet that redemption partly belonged to her. She had to make space for him. And perhaps this is the overlooked truth. Steven Tyler's most emotional comeback was not created on stage. It occurred in a daughter's willingness to know the man who had not been there to introduce himself. The world heard a love song. Behind it was a relationship learning how to begin after the beginning had already been lost. For decades, rock and roll told certain stories with a wink. The details were repeated in memoirs, backstage books, interviews, and documentaries. Older musicians spoke about teenage girls as though they were part of the scenery, like hotel rooms, broken televisions, or bottles lined across a dressing room table. People heard those stories. They simply did not always hear what they meant. Steven Tyler's past now exists inside that changing interpretation. Julia Misley, formerly known as Julia Holcomb, has alleged that she was 16 when Tyler began a relationship with her in the 1970s. She later accused him of grooming, sexual assault, and emotional abuse. Tyler has denied the allegations and disputed her legal claims. The case is not resolved. Most of Misley's claims were dismissed in April 2026, but one claim involving alleged intentional infliction of emotional distress was allowed to proceed toward trial. That distinction matters. Dismissal does not always mean a court decided something never happened. Sometimes it means a claim cannot proceed because of deadlines, jurisdiction, or the law under which it was filed. At the same time, an allegation reaching trial does not prove the allegation is true. The legal answer remains unfinished. The cultural question is already here. What should audiences do when behavior once presented as rock mythology is reconsidered through power, age, and vulnerability? That question makes people uncomfortable because it changes more than one man's biography. It challenges an entire era's preferred version of itself. In the old version, the rock star was irresistible. Rules disappeared around him. The young women nearby were described as willing participants in the adventure. Fame itself seemed to function as consent. But fame does not make power disappear. It concentrates it. A famous adult musician had money, transportation, access, employees, and an industry trained to protect the show. A teenage girl did not enter that world with equal control merely because she was allowed backstage. That observation should not require us to pretend we know what a jury will decide. It requires something more difficult, resisting the romantic language that shaped these stories before many viewers ever questioned them. Stephen's own published recollections became part of this debate. Passages associated with an underage girl were once received by some readers as evidence of the reckless excess surrounding 70s rock. Years later, similar details began to sound very different. The words did not change. The listener did. That may be the most revealing part of this chapter. We often imagine that a legacy changes when hidden information is uncovered, but sometimes the information was never hidden. It was printed, sold, discussed, and absorbed into the legend. What changed was society's willingness to ask who had the power inside the story and who paid for everyone else's entertainment. A separate lawsuit filed by former model Jean Bellino, who alleged that Tyler assaulted her when she was 17, was dismissed in 2024 because the court found it had been filed too late under the laws used. Tyler denied that allegation as well. Again, a procedural ending is not the same as a complete moral answer, and perhaps that is where many celebrity documentaries become too safe. They either avoid the subject to preserve nostalgia or present accusations as a dramatic final twist. Both approaches reduce real people to storytelling devices. This story should not do that. The point is not to erase Aerosmith's music. A song does not become inaudible because the person performing it becomes harder to admire. Nor does musical brilliance provide immunity from scrutiny. Two truths can remain in the same room. Steven Tyler helped reshape American rock music. He also faces serious allegations connected to a period the music industry spent decades glamorizing. One truth does not automatically settle the other. You may feel protective of the songs because they belong to your own memories. That feeling is real, but memory can become a shield when we use what an artist gave us to avoid examining what others say was taken from them. Stephen once controlled his history by turning excess into legend. Now the era itself is being reread. And this time, he is not the only person telling the story. There was always a performance inside Steven Tyler's survival. Not necessarily a dishonest one, but a performance nonetheless. Every return required an image the public could understand. The recovered addict, the reunited frontman, the father rebuilding what he had missed, the aging rock star who still moved as if time had made an exception for him. Stephen did not simply survive events. He learned how to present survival. That ability helped preserve Aerosmith for decades. It allowed audiences to look at the damage without feeling trapped inside it. No matter how dark the previous chapter became, Stephen eventually reappeared wearing something brighter, telling the story with enough humor and movement to suggest that the worst part was safely behind him. But the final years have resisted that transformation. The retirement from touring did not produce a clean farewell photograph. There was no last completed Aerosmith concert where the band stood together, absorbed the applause, and knew that everyone in the room understood what had just ended. Instead, the conclusion arrived through medical uncertainty and a written announcement. For a performer, that difference is enormous. A final concert allows the artist to shape absence before disappearing. The lighting can be chosen. The last song can be rehearsed. The crowd can be invited to grieve in the correct place and at the correct time. Steven Tyler was denied that control, and yet he has continued to appear. Occasional performances after the touring announcement complicated the public's understanding. He could still sing. He could still stand beside Joe Perry. He could still produce moments that resembled the old Stephen closely enough to awaken hope. But resemblance is not restoration. Watch those appearances carefully, and you may notice that the emotional center has shifted. In earlier decades, the audience waited to be overwhelmed. Now, it seems to protect him with its attention. People cheer not only because of what they hear, but because he is still willing to try. The relationship between performer and crowd has reversed. For years, Stephen carried the room. Now the room helps carry Stephen. There is dignity in that, but there is also something painful. Every note is compared with a sound that exists perfectly in memory. The younger voice never tires there. It never fractures. It never reaches for a note and discovers that the body has changed the route. How do you compete with your own recording? Perhaps you cannot. Perhaps the more important question is why we expect aging artists to do it. Audiences say they want honesty, but often reward illusion. We praise legends for growing older, then ask them to reproduce the exact physical experience they gave us 50 years earlier. When they succeed, we call them timeless. When they cannot, we speak as if something essential has been taken away. But Steven Tyler is still Steven Tyler without the full scream. That statement sounds obvious until you consider how much of his identity was constructed around producing it. The scarves, the mouth, the movement, the microphone stand. Each detail pointed toward the voice. The entire image promised that eventually he would open his mouth and release something larger than the body standing before us. Now the body remains, while the promise has changed. I suspect this is why his story feels more unsettling than the usual tragedy of an aging star. Steven did not simply lose a professional ability. He lost the most dependable way he had of explaining himself. On stage, contradictions could become energy. Addiction, desire, regret, anger, humor, and fear could all disappear into sound. A scream did not have to answer questions. It only had to make people feel something. Silence is less forgiving. It leaves space for the parts of the story that applause once covered. His extraordinary influence remains. So do the recoveries, the damaged relationships, the allegations he denies, the people who loved him and the people who say they were harmed. None of these elements disappears because the final song is powerful enough. There will probably never be one version of Steven Tyler that settles everything. Perhaps there should not be. A perfect farewell might have encouraged the audience to close the book too neatly. One last dream on, one final bow, and a career transformed into a completed monument. Instead, the ending remains open and uncomfortable. A man who spent decades rewriting his own conclusions is still here, but he can no longer control every sentence. Maybe that is not the ending Steven Tyler would have chosen. It may be the first one he could not perform.